You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
If you thought goldenly breaded McDonald's chicken couldn't get more golden, think Golder, because new sweet and smoky special edition Gold Sauce is here. Made for your chicken favorites at participating McDonald's for a limited time.
Senator Chester Arthur. It has a nice ring to it. And it almost happened. And if it happened, if Chester Arthur was able to get the Senate seat from New York, we'd probably never be speaking of him again, even on my podcast. Because although Chester Arthur is a pretty obscure president, he's at least a president. And had he obtained the Senate seat from New York, hell, there probably would have been no reason to run for anything else. It's a pretty prestigious honor. And Arthur comes pretty close. But Arthur still has a problem. There is a small but important crack between even the stalwart Republicans, between all sorts of people who all would say that they're working for Roscoe Conkling and working with Chester Arthur. We talked about in the last episode how beaten on the federal level, stymied by Hayes and the reformers, that Conkling and Arthur, certainly Arthur with his activities in the New York City Custom House-based political machine, were able to capture the state of New York, narrowly win the governor's race because the Democrats were split. And they also win the assembly races. Well, something happens. Senator Kernan, he was a Democratic House member from New York during the Civil War, but he was a war Democrat. He would go and talk to Lincoln. He was supportive of Union efforts. He's the first Catholic senator from New York. Couldn't matter less, because in the 19th century, you didn't get a U.S. Senate seat from your own popularity. You got it because your party won the state legislature. And right now, Republicans held the state legislature at the same time that Kernan's seat is up. So a new senator will be elected. Conkling wants Arthur for the Senate seat. But now, just as they're victorious at the state level, the Republicans, the stalwarts, want a few things. They want control over the city board of elections. If Republicans do not have control over the city board of elections, they cannot counteract Tammany Hall, and they'll lose elections in the city. And Arthur's kind of in control of the operation, the Republican operation, that is, in New York City, where he knows best. Still, it smacks to some of kind of a dictatorship, of kind of the thing Tammany Hall. Well, what are we, just trying to be Tammany Hall? It's also the fact that they want a group of aldermen to make nominations for the city and appointments for the city instead of the mayor, who is Cooper, who is an independent. He's not a Democrat quite or a Republican. They want to take that away and have an alderman board that's controlled by Republicans. It reminds us of Boss Tweed, the New York Times says. Arthur and others, Clint Wheeler, Stephen French, two very loyal machine commissioners, very close to Arthur, go up to Albany and hold what's called the Champagne Caucus, where they wine and dine members of the state legislature to try to get this legislation done. So one problem is that they're a little bold in the grabbing. And the second is, Alonzo Cornell is now governor of New York. And once elected, he gets a little guffy, we might say, a little willing to feel out how much power his position has as an elected official versus just a cog in the party machine. First, he expresses that he has some opposition to some of these things that they're trying to do. Arthur meets directly with Cornell. He denies everything. He denies that he's opposing these things. But when Arthur tries to get these bills through the New York State legislature that they had just elected, he can't get a bill passed. Then we get to the Senate seat. It's coming pretty clear that Cornell does not want Arthur in this Senate seat. Another player here, also a stalwart, is Tom C. Platt. Tom C. Platt is later going to become the boss of Republican politics in New York. He's going to become an annoyance to Theodore Roosevelt and very much vice versa. But right now, Thomas C. Platt is working in the political machine with, you might say, Arthur and Conkling, except he decides that he's not getting enough for all of his efforts, raising money and getting votes, and he also is a bit put off by Conkling's personality. This stuff still matters. We can talk about political machines, we can talk about parties, we can talk about which faction you're in all day and night. This stuff still matters. Platt is irritated by Conkling. Conkling is a very insulting, derisive person. Tom Platt is also jealous. These two things combined, Platt goes to Cornell. Cornell decides he doesn't like Conkling very much either and would like to do something a little more independent. And he doesn't want Arthur in the Senate seat. He'd like Platt, thank you very much. And Cornell and Platt start talking with non-Conkling Republicans. Cornell's a governor now. People are going to owe favors to him. So even within the stalwarts, there's this little bit, really, it becomes a big bit of a civil war. But of course, all of it's behind the surface. This is something important to understand because it dictates what's going to happen in the rest of this episode. Because if Arthur can't get his custom house job back, he didn't run for governor, and he can't get the Senate seat, there's only one chance that he has to go to Chicago and, along with the other stalwarts, bring back former President Ulysses S. Grant. And all they got to do is get through a little meeting in Chicago. Actually, a very big one. This was the scene in the Interstate Industrial Exposition building in Chicago in 1880 as men assembled for the Republican Convention. Red, white, and blue bunting, every seat taken. Allies and enemies alike would have to sit next to each other. Large open windows thankfully, mercifully bring air through the hall as people are pressed right up against the speaker's platform. The wigwam where Abraham Lincoln was nominated for president 20 years before had burnt down by then, but the memory of that event was lost on no one. These were Republicans about to nominate a president, a man for the same office as Lincoln, and everyone here, it seemed, had an agenda, a preference at least, someone they wished to see at the top of the ticket coming out of this building. And this is 1880. There are no primaries. There's a little talk and gossip, but the action happens in a few days in one building. Those who weren't pushing other delegates to vote for their man might be a reporter angling for a story for what was going to happen. Everyone, even someone with a majority, might come to this building with a plan, but it can go in any direction. In 1880, Chicago would prove to be one of those times. For Chester Arthur, his job was clear: to hold on to the stalwarts, the New York stalwarts. $300 votes, solid. If someone suggested a deal, they would not make a deal. They would hold. If someone else broke and there was a new favorite, they wouldn't join that. The stalwarts were not here to deal. They were here to vote solidly for their man, and that man was Ulysses S. Grant. Making deals is what sunk them in 1876 and got Arthur out of a job. As a wise contemporary politician would describe it later, the Republicans meeting here was split in three, like Gaul. Stalwarts, like Chester Arthur and Roscoe Conkling. Those who were for James Blaine and his half-breeds. Corrupt, but not so thirsty for patronage, or at least not making their thirstiness so obvious. And then a notable collection of independent-minded. Some goody-goodies, like Edmonds of Vermont. Some favorite sons, some anglers, some holdouts. A woman runs into this crowded hall. Blaine! Blaine! She is cheered. She is booed. And she is hoisted out of the chamber, shouting, Blaine! She's not the only heckler. No man can make a speech here in Chicago without hisses and without candidate names shouted during their speech. It's like a circus, but it's serious. Someone is going to come out of this presidential maker. For Arthur and Conkling, there is one name. Roscoe Conkling will step up to the platform for one of the best speeches that he's ever made in his life. When asked from whence our candidate came, we say from Appomattox. Planted stalwarts shout in full voice, Grant, 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 Grant. As Conkling supports running former president and the hero of the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant. Yes, there's been scandals in his administration, but he's come back from Europe, he's popular. The whole hall will cheer, Grant, Grant. Vote for him or not. You can't not cheer when we say the words Ulysses S. Grant. You can't not cheer for them. A few do. There's a few errant shouts for Blaine. You can hardly hear it. He laid his head back with a kingly frown. Undefeated in war, undefeated in peace. The man who can win in the North, who can win in the South, who can unite the country. Show me a better one, and I am answered. There's a demonstration in the hall. The walls are shaking. Show me a better one, and I am answered. This is the moment. If Grant is caught up in the momentum and nominated here, first ballot, at least the stalwarts believe the Democrats cannot beat them. This will be, he says, the Austerlitz, referring to the great Napoleonic battle of American politics. The Democrats are on the rise, but they'll be defeated. Democrats have had a good run recently. They have the House. They've been blocking a lot of what incumbent President Rutherford B. Hayes could do. With Tilden, with Bayard, or someone else, they might win. But they can't beat Grant. That's what Conkling thinks. Show me a better one, and I am answered. No one in this hall is going to. Some will nominate. There's a great speech nominating the plumed knight fighting for the Republican Party, James Blaine. Yeah, and if you're not noticing too much difference in rhetoric between half-breeds and stalwarts, that's not an accident. I mean, they're both essentially political machines of a sort. The half-breeds are a little more centered around one personality, James Blaine. They tend to be, in his personal magnetism, they tend to be more of the corporate attorney type, let's say. They tend to be less about simply a system of getting the customs office, but they want that office. Very similar. This speech that's made for the Plume Knight. But the enthusiasm is crazy for Grant. In his rhetoric, as in his political maneuvering, Conkling assured that the pieces would fall into place, and as he's making this dynamic speech, right behind him is his key lieutenant, Chester Arthur. His place always behind Conkling will lead some to believe that he had no role. Indeed, I read Candace Millard's excellent Destiny of the Republic, and it says, Arthur was wholly a creature of Conkling. He held no public office other than the collector of the Port of New York, which Conkling presumably granted him, which is true. Millard is not completely correct. She's not acknowledging that Arthur was Quartermaster General, New York, and that was an important position. We talked about that in episode 1, that he was the governor's man for the popular Governor Edwin Morgan, that he did have some cachet absent Conkling, but Conkling was the boss of this political machine at this time. And so certainly Arthur fell in line. He also knows it's the best chance for him to get back on his feet. So the crowd's wild. They get pretty excited about the speech for Blaine. And there are speeches for, say, Edmunds, a few other folks. Edmunds is going to be supported by Theodore Roosevelt and a small group of people wanting to go heavy on civil service reform. He doesn't have a chance. And then an odd situation occurs. John Sherman is running. John Sherman was the Treasury Secretary under Rutherford B. Hayes, so we should explain this situation. He's not a half-breed. He's not with Blaine. He's not a stalwart. He's not with Conkling. Okay? Sherman is the best representative of Rutherford B. Hayes you could get. Hayes is a one-termer. He won't accept a nomination, even if someone was going to give it to them, and this crowd won't. But Sherman is the best you get for who from the administration to run if you want to continue this very pro-civil service policy that they have, trying to wash the Republicans clean of any image of corruption. But he doesn't come to Chicago. That's okay. That's pretty common. Grant's not here either. Blaine's not here either. Although, as Conkling will sarcastically reference, Blaine is listening sort of from the telegraph wires, is listening for every move at the convention on the telegraph wires. So, to make a speech for John Sherman, who possibly has a third of, say, the votes that are going to be solid for Grant coming in here, comes the able, classically trained Congressman James Garfield of Ohio. And he makes a determination that he can't compete with the speeches for Grant, the speeches for Blaine. He's not going to get enough people shouting for his man, so he has to do the opposite. And indeed, he speaks even to this huge crowd where this is 19th century public service address system will be invented in 40 years. It's not time yet. So one has to speak with full voice, using the lungs to project as an actor on a stage would. And politicians are uniquely skilled that way to carry their voice. And Garfield can do that, but in this case, he'll speak more softly, firmly, but softly, and force the crowd to kind of listen to him. He wants the exact opposite effect of Conkling. Calm seas, he says. Calm seas will get the ship where we want. There's no reason to get carried away, he says, with nostalgia, with emotion, with excitement. That's not what's going to win for the Republican Party, for the voters out there. We can get all excited here about a candidate, but that's not what the voters are going to listen to. He uses logic, he uses reason. This is not his first appearance before the convention either. He made a passionate defense on behalf of some delegates that were attempted to be thrown out by Roscoe Conkling and others because of lack of credentials. And he stood up for the rights of these underdogs and prevailed at the convention. So the convention knows him. They've heard him speak here at this platform before. They like him. He's already on Conkling's radar. Conkling has no pretense about it. He even writes a note saying, "You're probably the real candidate from Ohio here," and in all of this. While he's speaking, Garfield does have the attention of the crowd. And at one point he says, "And who can lead us?" And the crowd answers, "Garfield." But no. He's not making a speech for himself. He's making a speech for John Sherman. But the crowd says, members of the crowd say Garfield. This is the first sign that something weird is happening here. But he makes his speech, and listen, it's not like there's any kind of big revolution or big cheer for his man, John Sherman, or anything like that. He finishes. There's speeches for some of the others. When the voting begins on the first ballot, Grant wins. But not enough votes. He's got 304 votes. Blaine only has 289. Sherman, Garfield's candidate, has 93. And then there are 74 votes for other people. Now, we said in the beginning that the stalwarts will have like 306 solid votes for Grant. Some from New York. Not all the New York delegates are for Grant. There are Blaine votes. There are stray votes in the New York delegation. They hold back a few votes for the second ballot and then bring them in to create a little bit of sense of momentum. So in the second ballot, it's 306, Grant. It's pretty similar with Blaine and Sherman and the rest. Third ballot, fourth ballot, fifth ballot, 6th, 7th, 11th, 21st, 27th, 31st. It's pretty much the same thing. And what Arthur's doing during this time is communicating with the delegates, making sure that they hold fast for Grant. If you remember what had happened in 1876, the way Hayes got the nomination is that they had held solid for the stalwart candidate for the first and second ballots, but then there was momentum in the later ballots. They're not going to let that happen. They're going to hold their full votes for Grant. No, why isn't Grant overtaking? Why is it constantly, 306 votes for Grant every single ballot? And Blaine either isn't really gaining at all. And if you're not gaining in a 19th century political convention, you're losing momentum, except that the stalwarts are holding fast to try to avoid that. I'll turn to William C. Hudson, who's going to talk about a lot of the events here. He's a reporter of politics at this time. He would have known all the people that we're talking about. It was not so much opposition to the man, Grant, as it was to the principle of a third term. From the moment the proposal had been made, there was an outburst of protestation and much talk of Caesarism. The discussion was heated as early as the summer of 1879, when General Grant reached San Francisco on his return from a world tour. The first ballot showed that while Grant had received the largest number of votes given for any single candidate, yet he was a minority candidate. The whole number of ballots cast was 760, of which he received 304. The majority had been cast against him, 456, a sufficient number to have nominated if they could agree on a single person. This is an important point. So while Grant is winning, he's not winning. As it was, Mr. Blaine received 284, Mr. Sherman 98, Mr. Edmunds 34, Mr. Washburn 30, Windom 10. These candidates discovered their respective strengths on the first ballot, and for the 34 that followed, there was little variation. Grant, Blaine, and Sherman. It was a deadlock, which was not broken until the 36th ballot. On the 34th ballot, all of a sudden, there are delegates for Garfield. And Garfield had not been present at all, any votes on the first ballot. His name appears on the second ballot, a single delegate voting for him. This delegate voted for him, occasionally being joined by another until the 14th ballot, when the name dropped out, not to reappear until the 19th ballot. Then the single delegate returned with this vote for Garfield. In the 34th ballot, there are votes from Wisconsin for Garfield, and the single vote grows to 17. In the next, the 35th, it goes to 50. So you get to the 36th ballot, and now there's growing support for Garfield. Some of Maine's delegates go for Garfield. Now, Blaine is from Maine. So if that's happening, you're seeing that Blaine's losing votes, and they're going to Garfield. Roscoe Conkling is now approached. Why don't you release some of your delegates and go for Blaine? Now, why would he do this? This is not because he wants to see Blaine in the chair. He'd never do that. Not the guy that called him a turkey gobbler strutter, No. But it would be to break Garfield's momentum. If some of the stalwarts cast their vote for Blaine, that'll reestablish Blaine's momentum enough to kill off this upstart Garfield movement before it becomes something. But even as a convention trick, Conkling, Arthur, the rest will not do it. And they hold with their vote 306 votes cast for Grant in the 36 ballot, except by now momentum has built for Garfield, and Garfield gets 399 votes. When the deadlock was broken by the nomination of Garfield, adjournment was immediately taken. Though the nomination had been anticipated by many for 2 days, yet when it came, it was a surprise to the workers, and there was an immediate realization that the old political lines had been broken, that new lines must be drawn, and that, elated as they were over their victory, responsibility now rested on the half-breeds, the supporters of Blaine. So the pause of an adjournment was seized to see what use could be made of the nomination for vice president in bringing about the peace. Okay. Now, we have some action going on while this adjournment. And you have to remember, this adjournment is occurring in a sea of bodies, in a giant hall where it's hard to move around. But yet, one of Garfield's supporters, ex-Governor Dennison of Ohio, who would have been, and not necessarily a spokesperson for, well, Garfield doesn't even know he's getting the nomination, so he hasn't set up a campaign apparatus yet. This isn't like a modern convention. So this notable figure would have been someone with some authority to sort of, quote, speak for Garfield. And assuming that, he goes over to the New York delegation. He wants his man Garfield to win. He knows that if the stalwarts come out like frumpy and upset, you're not going to win a general election against the Democrats, especially with an unknown name like Garfield running the ticket. You need the support of Conkling, even if you don't have his man running at the top of the ticket. So Dennison goes right over and talks to some of the New York men. Levi Morton would have been big in this. And he essentially says New York can have the nomination. He talks to Conkling himself and says, New York can have the nomination. Conkling replies, I haven't thought of anyone. He's not really interested. He'll say later to a reporter, it's like getting a suit of old clothes instead of a mansion. That's how he feels about the vice presidency. But when Clint Wheeler and Stephen French discussed the matter with Chester Arthur, he immediately and enthusiastically agrees that he would seek the nomination. So he doesn't go and get Conkling's approval first. They get, along with Thomas Murphy, who has a carriage. This is going to be very important. They go to the various hotels. They have the New York delegation. They bring up the name of Chester Arthur. They build support. There is some talk of Levi Morton, who's a very wealthy man. He's going to be governor of New York, and he's going to be vice president later during Benjamin Harrison's administration. There's some talk of him, but he decides not to run. And so this is critical, and these are some things that aren't often discussed. Probably the way the history of this thing is told is that in order to make Conkling happy, they put Arthur on the ticket. The Ohio men, the people around Garfield put Arthur on the ticket. It's not exactly what happened. Arthur seeks it out among the New York delegation. Dennison does not specify Arthur. He just specifies that New York shall have the choice. In fact, probably the last person they think New York will pick is a guy who got fired from the Custom House job. But they're not thinking like a stalwart. They're thinking like half-breeds. So the New York delegation is rallied, and somewhat, because there's no other name, they're leaning towards Arthur. And Conkling's out of it. He actually can't be found at this time. He's most likely sulking around. Arthur goes out to seek him. Here's what Hudson says. Though I was not assigned a duty at the convention and was in attendance only as an idle observer drawn thither by intense interest, I availed myself of the privilege of the room under a card of admission received through the courtesy of the chairman of the press committee. Thus it was at this time, approached for the meeting of the convention in the second session, I sought that room to write some letters. When I entered, a few of the correspondents were present, finishing up their work. In a short time they drifted away, and I was left sole occupant of a large room. Shortly afterwards, the man who in many respects had been the chief figure of the convention, Senator Roscoe Conkling, entered. If he noticed me sitting in an obscure corner, he gave me no heed. Conkling was plainly much perturbed. He walked up and down in the long aisle with energetic steps, sometimes gesticulating vigorously, as if giving emphasis to his thoughts, and often muttering aloud. Mr. Arthur enters the door, leading the platform. Senator Conkling was at the other end of the room, walking towards the door by which Mr. Arthur entered. Approaching each other, they met in the middle of the room, not far from where I was at work.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there is one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
I have been hunting everywhere for you, Senator, Mr. Arthur says. Well, sir, replies Conkling. The two men, as they faced each other, were notable figures. Conkling, tall, handsome, imperious. Arthur, quite as tall, if not taller, polished, refined, well-groomed, the type of man of the world, in his appearance giving no indication of being the leader of the Johnnies and the Jakes and the Barneys and the Mikes of New York City. There was a moment of hesitation. Finally, Arthur said, "The Ohio men have offered me the vice presidency." Now, Hudson gets this wrong, or he hears it wrong, or Arthur is lying to Conkling, one or the other. They did not offer it to him. But regardless, this is what Conkling says back to Arthur. Well, you should drop it as you would a red-hot shoe from the forge. Arthur pauses a second. I sought you to consult, not... Conkling's like, what is there to consult about? This trickster of Mentor, Ohio will be defeated before the country. There's something else to be said. What? You think of accepting? And then Arthur hesitates a moment and says slowly, but with emphasis, the office of the vice president is a greater honor than I ever dreamed of attaining. A barren nomination would be a great honor. In a calmer moment, you'll look at this differently. Well, if you wish my favor and my respect, you will contemptuously decline it. So Conkling wants him to not just say no, but it's like, take your VP job and shove it. That's what he wants. And here is what is the first clear documented break between these two individuals, where Arthur simply says, Senator Conkling, I shall accept the nomination, and I shall carry with me the majority of the New York delegation. So not only is he defying Conkling, who's kind of sulking here and just wants to give nothing to Ohio, but he also has the votes. And he'll get them without Conkling, which is a sign that Conkling is perhaps losing a little bit of power within this New York political machine. Certainly after today's events, not getting that Grant. If he got the Grant nomination, it would be different for Conkling. And you have to remember here, as Conkling is staring at Arthur kind of icily, and Arthur is defiant, that Conkling has stopped talking to people for even less offenses than this. And he storms out of the room. That's what we have of this encounter. I should note here that people that become vice president often hate the job. Many of them had been senators or governors or things like that. So you have in Arthur, obviously, a funny thing, it's the reverse. It's like somebody who actually wanted the job and did consider that even if this ticket was going to go down in defeat, at least his name would be on something other than being fired at the Custom House, other than being the symbol of corruption. But there's a few more steps. Those steps happen, though. Those steps happen. The New York delegation meets. Conkling does chair the meeting. Arthur's not there because he's being considered. And nominations are made. Someone suggests Levi Morton. He declines. Then the Ohio men, representatives of the Ohio delegation, come into the New York room. They're given the floor, and they say simply, we'll abide by New York's choice. Now, I have to say that something that's happened before this is that Dennison, goes to Garfield and says that he gave the nomination to the New York folks. And Garfield said, no, we don't want to. Garfield isn't really happy with Dennison's doing that. First of all, they probably should have considered James Blaine and his people and asked, at least consult with them. And secondly, you don't have to give the choice to the New York people for vice president. You can pick someone. And most people, if they're going to pick a New Yorker to kind of make that New York group happy, they're looking at Levi Morton. But it's too late. Dennison's is as good as a promise. And a promise made to Roscoe Conkling. You don't want to anger the New York group, just as your man Garfield's got the nomination. So the Ohio people say, essentially, whoever you nominate here we'll support. And then they nominate Arthur. There's actually some resistance now on the part of the Ohio men. And they say, they express some reservations about this nomination based on Arthur having been fired at the Custom House. And what comes back from the New York delegates, and Thomas Murphy's one of the people that answers back, you either take our nomination or you don't take a nomination from New York. You go pick someone on your own, but obviously the implication is that you'll have insulted us. And they go back, of course they have to accept, and reactions are mixed. John Sherman, not only did he lose the presidency here, but he thinks this is a ridiculous burlesque. You're going to put a person who was fired for corruption on the ticket. Democratic newspapers are going to have a field day with nominating General Chester Arthur, who had just been fired for corruption. But that's the way it goes. There are actually over 200 delegates who oppose Arthur's nomination for vice president. There are speeches on the floor against him. So it's not a solid thing, but the entire -1 Ohio delegation votes for him. The entire New York delegation votes for him. And he gets enough votes to become the vice presidential nominee. And there in the hall are Arthur and Garfield. And members come up to give them handshakes and to talk. Arthur's hand is worn out from all of the handshaking. A key thing is that the Grant pin that Arthur had on him, he still keeps on. It's once a stalwart, always a... And a lot of people interpret this as, well, I'm joining this ticket, but I'm still a stalwart. And it's noted in newspapers. However, one person who's not impressed, because he's not in the room anymore, is Roscoe Conkling. He does not stay for Arthur's nomination, the nomination of his erstwhile friend. He's on a train going home. For Arthur, now he's a national figure. This has in some ways erased the indignity of what happened in the past few years from his name. And when he comes back, there is a huge celebration when he gets off the train. He's not used to being in the front of politics. He's used to being in the back. He brings a reporter into his house on Lexington Avenue and tells him, this was a total surprise. Not really true. And I took hours to decide when the nomination was offered to me. Definitely not true. Things that you have to say. He'll make a speech to a crowd of 2,500 loyals in New York City at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. Will come from the balcony. And he'll issue an official written acceptance of the party's nomination, which is a feature of 19th century politics. In it, he'll mention civil service, probably not approved by Roscoe Conkling at this point. So we're seeing some potential points of friction in the future. This from Justice Doanecki in the Biographical Dictionary of Vice Presidents. In his letter of acceptance, Arthur supported suffrage for Black Americans. He praised Hayes' vetoes of Army bills, as they contained riders that would have prevented federal troops from keeping peace at the polls. In addressing himself to the spoils system, a major political controversy of the post-Civil War era, Arthur opposed civil service examinations. They seemed to exalt more educational and abstract tests above general business ability. and even special fitness for the particular work at hand. Yet, he continued, positions of responsibility should, so far as practicable, be filled by the promotion of worthy and efficient officers, and the punishment of all official misconduct should be prompt and thorough. Dwenneke also notes, he continues in his letter of acceptance, original appointments should be based on ascertained fitness. The tenure of office should be stable. Positions of responsibility should, so far as practicable, be filled by the promotion of worthy and efficient officers. These views, which I have long held, repeatedly declared and uniformly applied when called upon to act, I find embodied in the platform resolution, which, of course, I approve. That he, Arthur, may have been the first advance man in American political history. He coordinated many mass meetings and took charge of tours made by associates through the Middle West. Now, you have to remember that when we're talking about the investigation of complaints, Arthur is actually, being prompt and thorough. He's actually making an attack on what Hayes did to him at the Custom House. And that's not missed by people. But largely, his position is well accepted. I don't believe this is a document that Conkling would have written. Here's what E.L. Godkin says, and he's the writer in The Nation, actually the editor of The Nation. He describes Arthur as, if not exactly the wicked partner of the ticket, at least as the poor relation. He thought that the vice presidential candidate must be surprised to find his character rising by simple contrast with his chief. The New York Times wrote, though, General Arthur's reference to the civil service reform resolution of the Republican platform is more satisfactory to the friends of reform than General Garfield's. He knows that in order to win the election, you're going to need to carry New York. He writes to ask his running mate, James Garfield, to come to New York as early as possible, say in July. Garfield does not want to look that desperate and to look like he's a tool of the New York stalwarts, and so he declines. Arthur will also work on Roscoe Conkling, and the two of them have a fishing trip in Canada, and whatever was said there, it goes well. Conkling comes back, still Arthur's friend, and it wasn't like he didn't like what Arthur had done, but there is a conversation we have between Conkling and Levi Morton where it even as he's leaving the convention, Conkling moves to saying, well, it's a foolish decision, but if that's what he wants, kind of thing. Conkling's views will evolve over time where there could be an opportunity. And what they want in a series of letters becomes plain. It's like, give us, Garfield, the New York patronage. You become president. We're going to run anybody who's gets a federal office in New York. You have to run it through we want our advice. We want our consent. That's what is on the table. And they want to talk about it. They want to talk about it in person with Garfield. New York, Conkling does very little until August. They're sitting on their hands a bit. This is noted. Garfield eventually will agree to accept the invitation of the National Republican Committee, not the New York stalwarts, to come to New York. So it doesn't seem like he's meeting with Roscoe Conkling, except that they're going to have a meeting in the back with Roscoe Conkling and other New York delegation members. So in August, this happens, except at this meeting, Conkling doesn't show up. He leaves the presidential candidate, Garfield, with Arthur, with Thomas Murphy, with some of his lieutenants to make a deal. And that deal is exactly what they want. They want the patronage. They'll support him for president, but if it's New York, they want it. And you have to remember, New York has the most important federal office, the Custom House. Here's Candace Millard's The Destiny of the Republic. Garfield and James Blaine had become a lasting, if at times strained, friendship nearly 2 decades before when they entered Congress at the same time. Garfield liked and admired Blaine, But he had learned over the years that his friend could be a little reckless of his promises and a little selfish withal. As Blaine had risen to power, becoming Speaker in 1868, he had made and broken commitments to Garfield, with a nonchalance that Garfield found astonishing. Nevertheless, Blaine was a skilled tactician and a shrewd observer of events. Knowing that Garfield wanted to have men from both factions of the party in his cabinet, Blaine tried everything in his power to convince him that this was not just a bad idea but a dangerous one. When Garfield asked Blaine what he thought about offering the position of Secretary of State to Conkling, with the idea of keeping friends close and enemies closer, Blaine became horrified. His appointment would bring an act like strychnine upon your administration, first bringing contortions, then followed by death. So Garfield comes to New York, and everybody's at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. Arthur's there. Conkling's there initially. But what happens is, on the day that Garfield arrives, here's the candidate of the Republican Party, Roscoe Conkling leaves. And leaves it to Arthur, Platt, Thomas Murphy, other people to, in effect, talk to Garfield. Now, ostensibly, what this meeting is a meeting of the Republican Committee. There's like 100 people there that Garfield is meeting to see. But essentially, what the meeting's really about is Garfield calming the waters of the New York Republicans, who so far haven't lifted a finger for his campaign. Roscoe Conkling is not just showing temper here. It's strategy. You meet with my lieutenants. That way I can't be involved in this business. Also, you're not involved in dealing with me if I'm such a horrible villain out there. Arthur and the others talk to Garfield, and basically the conversation, we'll never know what happened in this private room because there's kind of two sides to it. But definitely from Thomas Platt's account, Garfield says that he will seek the consent of New York stalwarts on New York patronage. Garfield will dispute this account. Here's Reeves on the session between Garfield and the stalwarts. What precisely happened during the session remains in dispute. Platt writes about it in 1910. He says Garfield was told frankly that the Conkling machine wanted concrete assurances about the dispensation of patronage in New York before entering the campaign. We cannot afford to do the work and let others reap the reward. In reply, Garfield expressed his disfavor with Hayes and disavowed any sympathy with civil service reform. He acknowledged the Conkling machine's strength in New York, and adding he could not be elected without it. In reward for their help, Conklingites could have their way with the state's patronage. In dispensing those favors, he would consult with our friends and do only what was approved by them. Those assurances, Platt says, were oft repeated and solemnly emphasized, and were accepted and agreed to by all those present. And Thomas Reeves, who's writing Gentleman Boss, the biography of Chester Arthur, makes a good point that, look, we don't really know what happens in that meeting. Garfield could have very well made some statement like, I understand your feelings. And so Garfield only accepted that, yes, you told me what you wanted. I didn't agree to it. But I think Reeves is convincing on this point that stalwart politicians were no, yokels here. And after the meeting, they not only went to work, but Levi Morton talks to Garfield about arranging a special fundraising for the campaign in New York State. They would have had to get the work that they did in the campaign tells you that they got the assurance. And I think that's pretty convincing. Whatever Garfield said in New York, he returned to Mentor contending that he remained uncompromised. He writes in his diary, no trades, no shackles, and as well fitted for defeat or victory as ever. The best that Reeves can explain this, and I kind of agree with his analysis, is that honestly, Garfield may have been convinced that he promised to consult stalwarts on patronage, and that doesn't mean he was pledged to accept their proposals or their denials of somebody he wanted to appoint. Garfield will dispute this account. Nonetheless, the account is enough, and Conkling obviously trusts what Arthur and Platt tells him, for Conkling to say, okay, we can do business with Garfield. He's not thrilled with Garfield, but we'll try him. Still thinks he's a half-breed, still thinks he's talking to Blaine, which is correct, but we'll try him if we can at least get the New York office back, and the main one among that is a custom house. On that assurance, Conkling himself goes to Indiana, very important state in this election of 1880, going to be real close, and makes appearances in speaking in Indiana. Conkling himself goes to Mentor, Ohio, and meets with Garfield. Now, Garfield doesn't lose any face here because Senator Conkling has come to see him. Conkling claims that in a carriage ride, Garfield made the same promise to him that he made to Arthur and Platt in the New York meeting. A friend of Garfield's from Ohio is in that carriage ride with Conkling and says it didn't happen. Okay, coming back from the trip west, Conkling says to Arthur that the speeches went very well and things are going well, and Arthur just catches him. Sir, given the militant nature of your note, I can assume we can sign you up for some New York appearances. Got to remember, again, we're not just talking about some penguin boss in the back of the, back table counting money here, doling out jobs. Conkling's a good speaker. You want him out there. He's one of the best. And him and Grant, with appointments booked by Arthur, campaign all over the state of New York. Arthur will raise money not only for New York, but will specifically raise money for Indiana. Now, Indiana at this time in the 19th century is famous for simply buying votes. And both parties did it. And what you needed was money. If you didn't play, you weren't going to get any. Even buying people, there's a famous joke about, Thomas Marshall, who was governor of Indiana and Wilson's VP, has a great story about this. I'll see if I can find it. In any case, he's going to raise money for Indiana as well. And some of those votes are going to go just flat to paying people for votes. But this was done, again, was being done on both sides in Indiana at the time and probably other states. Here's from Thomas Reeves. Grant returned to New York on October 9th and was welcomed by festivities staged by the state committee. A parade 7 miles long, containing 60,000 people, filed by a reviewing stand, on which sat Ulysses S. Grant and Arthur. Some 800,000 spectators were said to make this the largest rally in city history. When Conkling returned to New York 2 weeks later, Arthur greeted him with a request for further activity. I understand from the military style of your telegram that you report for duty, and so ask whether I shall now make some appointments for you in this state. Within a few days, under Arthur's direction, Conkling and Grant were speaking their way across New York, as we said. Arthur's state committee pursued voluntary contributions from government employees with a zeal rarely, if ever before, observed in Empire State politics. New York was, of course, a fertile field for such demands. The annual payroll of city officials alone was nearly $11 million. Salaries at the post office and custom house amounted to over $2 million a year. The committee mailed 12 series of assessment circulars in the 67 days leading up to the election. Silas Burt, who we said was the civil service employee in the custom house and not the only one that didn't contribute to these things, never were the committees as persistent and arrogant in their demands upon the custom employees as in 1880. Few public servants were spared. Circulars were sent to federal judges, police chiefs, workers on the new Capitol building at Albany, right down to the night watchman, employees of the State Museum of Natural History, and lighthouse keepers. Arthur's involved in all of this fundraising effort. Sometimes subordinates do the work. For instance, a judge might raise money from the other judges. Now, there's two things to say about this. It's coercive. We wouldn't want this today. 19th century voters again and again expressed that they didn't want this in their time and established strong civil service reform, which we'll get into the next episode. But such were the rules at the time. This is how you raise political money, and a good portion of these employees were happy to contribute. Either happy to contribute because this is the party that got me my job. If they lose, I'll lose my job. Democrats will take over. There goes the patronage. There goes my job. Also, I happen to like this party. I like high tariffs. I like their policies. See, just like today, people would donate. But you did get opposition. Here's a postmaster that wrote back. You may, and I presume you have the power to influence government employees through fear of losing their positions, if they are base enough to sacrifice principle for supposed financial gains. But I deem the practice pernicious in its effects and a baneful influence in politics on this country. Okay, so you did have a few stragglers who didn't donate. The only letter that Arthur signs with his name is one that just generally asks for support. Take heed. No feeling of security shall tempt you to abate your efforts. See to it that the canvass in your neighborhood is thorough and that every Republican ballot is polled and counted. Push things. Here's Candace Millard again. On October 25th, a political meeting of the colored citizens at the Cooper Institute in New York filled an entire hall to overflowing. It could not have been larger, a reporter said of the gathering. For every inch of space in the large hall was crowded. The seats were filled almost as soon as the doors were open, and in a very few minutes all the standing room was taken. Even more remarkable than the size of the crowd was its complete racial integration. Just 15 years after the end of the Civil War, black men and white, a newspaper reported, were in almost equal proportion throughout the hall and on the platform. The keynote speaker, the cause of all the excitement, was Frederick Douglass. After climbing to the platform, the august former slave, now a human rights leader and marshal of the District of Columbia, wasted no time in telling his audience which presidential candidate would receive his votes. James A. Garfield must be our president. I know him. He is right on our questions. Take my word for it. He's a typical American all over. He has shown us how man in the humblest circumstances can grapple with man, rise, and win. He's come from obscurity to fame, and we'll make him more famous. In 1880, it's recorded that 90,000 to 125,000 was brought in by various assessments. A lot of money in this year. Okay, so there are attacks on Arthur in this campaign. There are attacks on him saying that one rumor is he was born in Ireland and had been brought to the United States by his father when he was 14. Arthur denies the charge, saying his mother was a New Englander who never left her native country. Then they said, okay, it's not Ireland. Arthur was born in Canada, just across the Vermont border, where his mother often visited her parents. But as Reeves says, little attention was paid to the charge during the campaign of 1880, for Garfield was a young, robust man who could easily be expected to fill 1 or 2 terms in the White House. This is the feeling. Rutherford B. Hayes is not happy about Arthur running for vice president, but kind of says, well, it's a sop to Conkling, and in fact, it just shows how much they've lost and we've won. Essentially, we've got the top of the ticket. This is the way most people are thinking. It's a close election. The parties are really close in 1880. And Garfield gets tripped up in this fake letter business where someone writes a letter that he said he loved immigration, particularly Chinese immigration would allow everyone in. It takes him a week to verify that he didn't write the letter, which is sort of a bad luck for him and also poorly handled. He's not a name like Ulysses S. Grant. He's an unknown, James Garfield. Outside of Congress, people don't know him. So it's close. And he's running against a war hero, Hancock. Fortunately, Hancock also has his problems. And makes a very, hard to understand and not well-liked statement about the tariff. That makes it seem like he doesn't understand the issue at all. tariff for local purposes only. What does that mean? So you have the election. 80% of eligible voters, men 21 and older, vote in the 1880 election. It's a record. The South, Florida, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, Arkansas, guaranteed. Missouri and Arkansas, guaranteed for the Democrats. Louisiana, too. They go to Hancock English. California is bitterly close, but Hancock wins it. New Jersey is a swing state in 1880, but by 2,000 votes, 0.7%, Hancock wins it. Nevada goes for Hancock. Maryland, Delaware. But Republicans have their states. Pennsylvania goes for Garfield Arthur. Of course, Ohio, Massachusetts, Vermont, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Connecticut, it's close. But by 50 to 49, Garfield wins. Indiana, again, close. 49 to 47, Garfield wins. Oregon, close, but 50 to 49, Garfield, Arthur win. But the jewel of 19th century American politics is New York State, and it's achingly close. Hancock wins Albany, Hamilton County, Brooklyn, Kings County, New York City, Manhattan, Richmond, which is now Staten Island, Queens County, Oswego County, Rockland County, Westchester County, Sullivan County, for 534,511 votes. But Garfield gets 555,544 votes, a margin of 21,000. Key to Arthur's success is what happens in the city, an improvement over the 1876 election in both New York County, which is Manhattan, and Kings County, which is Brooklyn. They still lose, but lose by less, an improvement all over the state. James Garfield is now President of the United States, elected, and the office seekers go to come to see Garfield. He's immediately flabbergasted by this. He's not used to it. I'm used to ideas, to talking to men, not trading jobs. This has happened. This will happen with every president, wearied by office seekers. Every time he gives a little to New York, a few minor cabinet positions, Blaine complains. He gives Blaine in December, the big one, Secretary of State. He asks Blaine to keep it under wraps, which Blaine does, but eventually it gets out. From Thomas Reeves, on the day following the election, Chester Arthur relaxed at the Fifth Avenue Hotel, accepting congratulations from dozens of callers and acknowledging receipt of hundreds of telegrams. He charmed well-wishers with his modesty, but it was no secret that inwardly he glowed at the prospect of becoming the 7th New Yorker to serve as vice president. A few months earlier, he had felt disgraced before his family, his party, and the nation, the victim of a hypocritical president and a handful of priggish visionaries. Now he could enjoy great social prominence and a measure of national political influence. He knew nothing about presiding over the Senate, the only job of the vice president at this time, but he would quickly learn. And so again, as I pointed out, I could name so many vice presidents that ended up not liking the job. Hannibal Hamlin tells a future vice president, "You don't want this." I believe it's Henry Wilson. "You don't want this job. Never get this job." Thomas Marshall makes the famous joke about a man went to sea, and then another one became vice president. Neither of them were ever seen again. You see this again and again about the vice presidency. And yet for someone like Chester Arthur, it's exactly the opposite. This is the greatest honor of his life. And as far as he or anybody knows, this is all he's going to get. And as we're going to discuss in the next episode, he's got an opportunity to improve his stature. But he's clearly going in as a stalwart vice president at this point. And he wants to do as much as he can to bridge the gap that there may be between Conkling and the new President Garfield. So he uses his position as vice president to get as much as he can and to thwart Blaine as much as he can. And he goes to work doing this, as we'll see in the next episode, where he is going to become one of the country's consequential vice presidents.
From the creators of the popular science show with millions of YouTube subscribers comes the Minute Earth podcast. Every episode of the show dives deep into a science question you might not even know you had. But once you hear the answer, you'll want to share it with everyone you know. Why do rivers curve? Why did the T-Rex have such tiny arms? And why do so many more kids need glasses now than they used to? Spoiler alert, it isn't screen time. Our team of scientists digs into the research and breaks it down into a short, entertaining explanation, jam-packed with science facts and terrible puns. Subscribe to Minute Earth wherever you like to listen.